The existential threat of climate change and how green and blue infrastructure might come to the rescue. That's the topic for this episode of Land Matters, the podcast of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. I'm your host, Anthony Flint. Even if the world stopped all carbon emissions tomorrow, scientists say we'll still see the impacts of climate change in the decades ahead. Sea level rise, storm surge and flooding, increasingly unpredictable and volatile weather, and more. And of course, the world is not going to stop all carbon emissions tomorrow. So a plausible course of action, it would seem, would be to take steps to reduce emissions to make the future less bad, and at the same time, roll up our sleeves to prepare cities for these inevitable impacts by building resilience. At the Lincoln Institute, we've been working on ways to address climate change through land policy, and we've published a new book, Design with Nature Now, that showcases some of the best strategies coming out of landscape architecture and other disciplines for dealing with climate change. And we're really excited about our guest for this show because he's one of the editors of the book, Billy Fleming, director of the McHarg Center at the University of Pennsylvania. Billy Fleming, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Well, let's start with the big picture. Public awareness and political support with regard to climate action. Recently, we've seen the 16-year-old activist Greta Thunberg making powerful speeches, of course, also the climate strikes and televised climate town meetings in the presidential campaign. You've been around this for a long time. Do you see a tide turning?
I definitely do. I think a couple things are at play here. One is that, on the design side, we've been prototyping things for a long time. So, there are many, many projects out there, some of which are captured in our book, Design with Nature Now, and some of which are not, that have been trying to deal with either decarbonization or climate adaptation in really sort of creative, innovative ways. And so we have this reservoir of ideas now to draw on that maybe, we didn't have 20, 30, 40 years ago when climate change as a sort of idea was coming into the public consciousness. But we also have, a rising set of generations in millennials and Gen Z for whom, their entire lives have been shaped by the ecological crisis that is climate change, along with the Great Recession and a few other crises. They've had a lot to deal with. And so, they've been sort of molded by this in ways that prior generations have not. And it's led them to make, climate change and climate activism, if not the most important, then one of the most important things in their lives. It's why we have, Greta Thunberg, coming to the UN to give the incredible speech she gave, but it's also why we have groups like the Sunrise Movement and the climate strike that we all just sort of, either participated in or got to witness a couple of weeks ago, sort of exploding onto the scene in the way that they are, because you have these rising generations who have committed themselves and their lives to fighting climate change in a way that previous ones have not. And so I do see this as like a different moment for us than the way the landscape of climate action looked when I started doing this a decade or so ago.
Now, in terms of mitigation, what struck me for a while now is some of the basic goals are not that complicated. To prevent future warming that would have catastrophic effects on the planet, us humans need to decarbonize the power grid, decarbonize transportation, and stop cutting down trees that suck up carbon and store it away. Would you agree with that? And what else would you add?
Yeah, I mean, the sort of interesting part about all this is that most of what we need to do doesn't require a whole lot more research and development or innovation. There are certainly parts of the decarbonization or mitigation problem that do. We don't know how to make carbon-free steel. We haven't quite figured out how to make carbon-free concrete, although we know how to make carbon-free concrete in general. So there are a few parts of the mitigation side that we haven't quite cracked yet and that we need a little bit more R&D for. But for a lot of things, especially around decarbonizing electricity and, putting as many things as we can onto the grid, like our cars through electric vehicles, the tech is there. It's just a question of getting enough money to deploy it. And so, we're at this moment now where we have this reservoir of ideas on mitigation and adaptation from design. We have this reservoir of technology from sort of the energy sector, the engineering sector, and we're kind of coming to this moment at which grassroots organizers and activists are sort of opening the window for us to act. And it's really exciting because I do think we have the ability to do a lot of things really quickly that we wouldn't have been able to do even 10 years ago during the stimulus period for the Obama administration.
So cutting emissions is tied up with all kinds of global geopolitical complexities, so most would say that the Paris Agreement was at least a start. Can there be real change even if every nation or continent isn't moving in unison or in the same direction?
Absolutely. I mean, I think a big piece of this is getting the United States to meet its obligations. I think when you look at the last set of major climate negotiations in Paris, but even if you look back to Kyoto before that, the United States has become almost infamous in this regard for negotiating very aggressively to water down many of these international agreements and then backing out of the international agreement itself. So we end up with a protocol or an agreement that is less effective than much of the rest of the global community would have wanted, and without the U.S. as a signatory or an active participant in it. And so I think in order for us to be able to mobilize the rest of the world around climate change in a way that isn't really happening at the moment, there are sort of little bits and pieces of good stories, some in Europe, some in China, but no one is really getting as far as they would want or need to. The U.S. really has to step up and meet its obligations to convince the rest of the world to come along. That will require us. One of my colleagues, Leah Stokes, who's a political science at the University of California, Santa Barbara, says that the first real, and she's an energy policy expert, she's the person who everybody I think in the media goes to analyze 2020 presidential candidate climate plans and Green New Deal plans every time they're released. But she would tell you that the sort of first domino that has to fall for us to get to global net zero emissions is for the U.S. to decarbonize its electricity sector. And that's absolutely right. I think the U.S. has to sort of jump first and to sort of create or open up a market for lots of this stuff to be deployed really quickly. And it's one of the things that can not only, I think, sort of bring the tech to bear for the rest of the world to go ahead and do some of this stuff, but can also restore some of that faith that's been lost in our position as sort of a negotiator or a partner in many of these international agreements around climate change. And we're not going to get to a point where you can really see the impact on emissions through mitigation without that sort of wave of international action. Simply because climate change is a global issue, we've contributed more to it per person than any other country, but we still need other countries to come along with us. Because of the way we've behaved as a country on climate, we sort of owe it to them and to ourselves to be the first ones out of the gate to do this right.
Okay, so we've talked a little about mitigation. Let's turn to adaptation and building resilience, although I should say, as Design with Nature Now makes clear, building resilience done right can double as emissions reduction strategies, so it's not entirely separate, nor should it be. But with regard to the preparations that need to be made, it seems like this should be a national mobilization, just staying within the U.S. for a moment. Instead, we have a lot of disparate efforts, mostly cities, where leaders are frankly concerned about nothing less than public safety, that is, protecting life and property from repeated disasters. Is this going to be good enough, or do we need the equivalent of the Federal Highway Program or the Moonshot?
Yeah, I think the short answer is no, it's not good enough. And yes, we absolutely need the Federal Highway version of a moonshot, or the federal, sort of approach version of a moonshot to all of climate change. Doing it for highways would be great. We need to do it for a lot of other things. And I think, the defining factor of national policy in the United States, whether it's dealing with the federal highway system, whether it's dealing with, housing and urban development, whether it's dealing with environmental regulation and management, whether it's dealing with industrial policy or any other sort of aspect that you might think of as being touched by something like the Green New Deal, the defining factor is that we have no goals and no framework. And it's really hard to imagine getting to a point as a country where we're meeting our obligations on climate change, and that means getting to net zero emissions and adapting every community where people live to the effects of climate change. We need some standards. We need some national goals. We need a national framework because, at the very least, climate change for us is a national problem. It's really an international problem, but it certainly cannot be dealt with in any meaningful way by any one city, any one neighborhood, even any one state. I think we're seeing, states like California and now increasingly New York doing some really interesting things on climate change and maybe building models or prototypes for us on the policy design side. But we also know that those one or two or three or four states or a half dozen or dozen cities doing that on their own in isolation outside of a national set of goals and frameworks is never going to get us where we need to go.
All right, but still, People are rolling up their sleeves, coming up with ideas and innovations. A lot of that is what Design with Nature Now is about. Can you help define green and blue infrastructure or just describe some of the more promising efforts that are detailed in the book, Design with Nature Now?
Sure. So, really the thing that differentiates green and blue infrastructure from more conventional gray infrastructure has to do with its sort of decentralized and landscape-based approach to dealing with all kinds of things. So for green and blue infrastructure along the coast, it's the difference between, say, building a large reinforced dune or wetland system as opposed to a system of levees or flood walls that you might see in more conventional flood control or flood mitigation projects. And you can see some of this kind of stuff in our Design with Nature Now set of projects. So we have the Big U and New Urban Ground in Manhattan, the former project of the Arctic Angles Group and One Architecture led by Matthias Bau, and the latter of Susanna Drake at Eland Studio and the folks at the ARO at MoMA. And those are really, they're dealing with climate change and flood mitigation in Lower Manhattan in very different ways. The Big U is this system of sort of berms and flood walls that are all integrated and sort of tailored to each neighborhood of Lower Manhattan as part of a large sort of interlocking system of different kinds of barriers that you might think of as kind of a hybridized green and gray infrastructure system. So some communities have retractable flood walls that when the water is high, sort of keeps the water out, and when the water is low, open up and allow them to get access to new waterfront parks and all kinds of other amenities. And some communities will have just a large reinforced berm that acts as a park, unless floodwaters are trying to get in, and then it really just keeps them out. But it's this approach of really sort of trying to raise the entire edge of Lower Manhattan by quite a lot, by I think up to like 10 or 12 feet in some places. And then you have, in the New Urban Ground project from Susanna and her partners at Eland Studio, you have still some raising, so they're adding 5 or 6 feet to the waterfront edge of Lower Manhattan. But they're, instead of sort of relying entirely on that, they're then sort of overlaying a whole bunch of green infrastructure as a way to sort of buffer wave energy around it. So stretching out from that raised edge is this proposed series of constructed wetlands that would create habitat and maybe at low tide or at low water moments, some new park space for people, but would also help buffer wave energy as it comes in from whatever the next superstorm Sandy might look like. And then on the sort of developed side, on the sort of land side of Manhattan, building this huge new integrated system of sort of green infrastructure that's geared towards managing stormwater differently. Because New York, like many other post-industrial or old cities along the east coast of the U.S., has a combined sewer system. And so when it rains today, it tends to overflow its sewer system and its ability to manage stormwater to the point that it dumps effluent and sewage into its harbor, into its bays. And this would be one way of dealing with that stormwater in a different way, in addition to thinking about how wave energy and storm surge are dealt with through green and blue infrastructure. And then beyond that, we have a couple other projects in there that are trying to integrate decarbonization and adaptation at the same time. Those are really projects about resilience and adaptation. But if you look at the 2050 and Energetic Odyssey project that was led by Holland as part of the Paris talks, but is really covering the whole of the North Sea. What they're trying to do there is harness the wave and wind energy of the North Sea to power all of Northern Europe on clean energy, and to use that sort of massive wave of investment that would be required to develop all that new generation and transmission as an excuse to go ahead and go in and start armoring the edge of the coast of those countries with a mix of gray and green infrastructure. And again, looking at places along the edge of Northern Europe that are highly urbanized, putting in mostly gray infrastructure, so mostly walls and other things that can protect them, and in places that are a little less heavily developed, building new green and blue infrastructure. Holland is very, very good at building reinforced dunes. They do it better than probably anyone else in the world. And so you see a lot of that along the edge of that project. And these are, when I say there are, a sort of bunch of prototypes out there for us to draw on, those are 3 really important ones as we think about the future of the coast of the United States, especially. And to sort of bring it back to the moonshot for one other Second, I would say that particular reference doesn't get used enough when we're talking about climate action in the U.S. I think it gets bandied about occasionally in discussions of the Green New Deal, but really people are referencing quite directly and quite primarily the New Deal when they talk about the GND. But the moonshot is at least as good a reference, in part because that's a moment in 1962 when JFK, gives his moonshot speech in Houston and says, something to the effect of, we choose to go to the moon, not because it's easy, but because it's hard. And, having no idea really how to get there. That step maybe 100 was setting a person down on the moon, and steps 1 through 99 were completely unknown. And that's kind of the situation we find ourselves in now. We know we have to get to a fully decarbonized economy. We know we have to get to, a fully adapted nation to not just the sort of flooding effects of climate change, but the whole bundle of effects that include heat and drought and all kinds of other things. And even though we have this reservoir of ideas for how we might do it, we don't really know how to build this stuff as fast or as well as we'll need to really handle this challenge going into the 21st century. So we're going to have to figure out steps 1 through 99 as we go on this as well.
And we should touch on the small matter of how to pay for it all, right? It sounds like an incredible investment. A little bit of trial and error, which is okay. Some rockets blew up in the moonshot effort, but what you're describing sounds pretty expensive. I should also say that the alternative, doing nothing, will just result in billions and billions of economic losses every time a storm like Sandy hits. But still, we're talking about a major investment, so I'm curious about your thoughts about financing this green and blue infrastructure. And maybe it includes a new view of protected land or higher ground. That's going to be more valuable real estate. Is there some connection there between these kinds of investments and this new value that's created?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of things off the top that always have to come into any conversation about, how to pay for, the response to the climate crisis. One is that the lowest end estimate for the cost of doing nothing, or the cost of sort of doing what we're doing now, which is kind of building a few nice one-off projects every few years, is about $64 trillion in losses. So, the cost of doing nothing by the end of the century on climate change, or doing nothing more than we're doing now, is so catastrophically huge. We're talking about a potential double-digit loss of GDP over the course of the century from not responding to climate change. So I think even when you look at the most, sort of wildly ambitious plan in the 2020 field, which is Bernie Sanders' plan, I think he's proposing something like $16 trillion. So, a quarter or so of the cost of what it would take to, or what would happen if we were to do nothing or to do what we're doing now in response to climate change. And so, when you get to that kind of a number, it's really hard to keep track or really understand how much that is or what it means, because there's, more zeros in there than I think there are letters in my name. But it's a lot of money, and the cost of doing something is far, far less than doing nothing. And the other is that, so that's the first thing, I think, is that we tend to really underestimate the cost of doing nothing when we talk about the cost of doing something. And the second is that, really the response to climate change, and maybe, how we deal with our health and education systems in this country, are really the only things on the table that ever have to answer this question. When we talk about, how we deal with, Department of Defense spending, how we deal with national security, how we deal with all kinds of other things where there are huge sort of contractor systems in place to benefit from, government spending, we don't hold them to the same standard that we hold the response to climate change and health and education in this country. And there are a couple of problems with that, but one is that, there actually is quite a bit of money already in the system to pay for this thing. And if you listen to, people like Stephanie Kelton, Stephanie is at Stony Brook University. She was the chief economist for the Senate Budget Committee for a couple years when Bernie was the ranking member. And she, is kind of traveling all over the world now, teaching and talking about modern monetary theory, which is very closely linked to Keynesian economics. She would tell you that there's already lots of money available in the system to spend on climate change today that we don't think about as available. And that's really the only question that matters when you're talking about a national mobilization, which includes, huge influxes of national capital and funding for projects like this and financing for projects like this, is whether or not it's driving inflation. And if you can keep inflationary pressure down as you're building all of this stuff, then it actually the number you're spending or the deficit, the size of the deficit you're running, really has little or no effect on any of the things we might care about. And so I think if you look at what's already there in the system, and we just had this event at Penn a couple of weeks ago called Designing a Green New Deal. It was many things for us, but it was also the close of the Design with Nature Now exhibitions, and really the last thing on our docket before the book itself comes out. Stephanie really walked us through how much slack essentially there is in the economy today, which is in the hundreds of billions that could be spent that isn't being spent on climate adaptation, climate mitigation. And then if we were to think about finding money in other places, either by cutting the size of our military spending, where we spend more than the next 24 or 25 countries in the world combined, all of whom are allies, or if we think about big changes in the way that our healthcare system is run, either by pursuing something like a national healthcare system through Medicare for All, or thinking about some kind of public option or expansion or addition of the Obamacare system we have now. Both of them free up hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars in money that is spent on healthcare today that could be spent on climate adaptation and climate mitigation tomorrow. And so, I think, I'm not an economist, but I listen and read, listen to and read economists a lot, especially Stephanie and her MMT partners now. And I've become convinced that this question of how we pay for it is really just a distraction, that the money is there, and for the amount that's not there that we think we might need to get there, is really just a matter of shifting resources around from places where we spend really inefficiently, like on defense contracting, and shifting that funding into climate adaptation. And this is part of why I think the folks who are driving the Green New Deal conversation talk so much about federal industrial policy and national mobilization, because those are really the two big sort of federal levers or federal instruments that allow you to sort of marshal the resources you need and the way you need them to deal with this problem at the scale at which it's occurring.
Well, it's a lot to think about. I mean, we've done this before. We've gone to war. We've built an infrastructure system with the federal highway system. We've built canals, and we've risen to the occasion. Yeah,
I mean, I just want to say, I think if you look back at the New Deal era, this is a moment where actually the reference makes a ton of sense, because there we're dealing with a sort of series of three overlapping crises. You have the financial crisis of the Great Depression. You have the ecological crisis of the Dust Bowl, where 3.5 million people are permanently displaced essentially and moved all over the country as the Midwest farming system collapses. And you have, the third kind of global crisis, which is the rise of fascism. And if you look around today where we find ourselves, we have, again, financially, we sort of find ourselves struggling to, break out of the spiral of the Great Recession of 2008 and 2009. We find ourselves living through a new and much larger ecological crisis and climate change. And we find ourselves once again internationally dealing with the sort of rise of fascism, not just abroad, but here in the United States as well. And during the New Deal, one of the things that Keynes did was write a book in the run-up to World War II called How to Pay for the War, where he literally made the case, made the calculations for how to do exactly what Stephanie Kelton is now describing through modern monetary theory, which is to spend on things that we need to tackle this huge existential problem. For them, it was fascism, and for us, it's probably also fascism, but really it's climate change, I think, is what we're talking about today. And to do it in a way that doesn't drive inflation up and allows you to sort of mobilize national resources at a scale that enables you to win whatever challenge you're trying to face. And so, I remain confident that we can figure out how to do this. We've been there before. We just have to learn how to build things really well and really quickly again, something we haven't done in a long time in this country.
Before we conclude, just a note about Design with Nature Now. It has an interesting backstory, does it not? It's an update of the book published by Ian McHarg, for whom your center is named. I wondered if you could say a quick word about Ian McHarg. How is his approach a good model for all the work that needs to be done on climate now?
Yeah, I mean, Ian really pioneered the integration of all kinds of information into the design process, and for him, it was about layering, geologic and geographic and economic and all kinds of other information onto physical places, and thinking about suitability from the perspective of where certain kinds of development should go and should not go. And the work he and his colleagues did on that, began in an analog fashion with them literally sitting down for hours in the studio and drawing, overlaying trace paper with markers and drawing to listen to some of the students who used to do that, many of whom have been around as we've been kind of ramping up the center and getting Design with Nature Now out there as an exhibit and a book, would tell you, it was both really fun. And I think, when most of them sort of first started getting high, so they would sit there with those markers and draw all night, get kind of loopy with Ian up there in studio. But what they were doing eventually led to, the first real set of computerized or digitized layerings of information that would become what we all know today as GIS, and which has become really ubiquitous. And you can sort of trace the rise of many of the sort of digital GIS companies to Penn and to Ian's time there and to his students, some of whom, like Jack Dangerman, who runs Esri, and Carl Steinitz, who, is sort of the father of geodesign and wound up going to Harvard as well. But they all sort of had some interaction with Ian, either while he was chair at Penn or when he taught at Harvard, or some combination. And so if we think about like how that applies to the way we think about this stuff today, it's not probably going to be in the same way. We're not, we've figured out, I think, how to layer information and do suitability analysis and all kinds of other sort of large-scale data integration as it pertains to landscape. It's become almost ubiquitous in the practice of landscape architecture and environmental planning today. But I do think, the idea that you can use design as a sort of instrument for integrating all kinds of other bodies of knowledge into real physical projects that change, communities and change lives and eventually change the world, is a lesson we can draw from Ian. And the other is that, Ian was a very brash and brazen, and I think you said charismatic person. He was maybe the first, certainly the last real public figure in design. He had a TV show on PBS. He hung around with the luminaries of the environmental movement, like Allen Ginsberg and all kinds of other people. He was one of the most sought after figures around the environmental movement, not just in design, but in the country during the 1960s and 70s. And that was important because he was willing to take on policy and political challenges in a way that most other folks who came before him, and certainly most of the folks who came after him, simply have not. And I think the lesson we can learn from Ian there is that, design is always going to have, I think there's always going to be a role for designers who are working on high design and really what we might think of as kind of beautiful things for the rich. But that's most of what design does now. And I think the lesson, from Ian is that there are many, many other things that design can and should do, most of which have different clients. They're probably more public than that sort of conventional mode of design. And they probably grapple more directly with the various political challenges that climate change and climate justice are going to bring. And so I think, design is going to have to find its way back into the messiness of politics again in a way that we sort of left behind in the 1980s and 90s.
Well, from all accounts, the planet's almost at the point of no return in terms of taking meaningful action on climate change. It seems like there's never been a greater need for more information and more ideas about what to do at this perilous moment. So, Billy Fleming, thank you for helping to create Design with Nature Now and for all the work that you do.
Thanks for having me on. I mean, I remain really optimistic that we're going to figure out a way to do all of this.
By the way, you can check out the book, Design with Nature Now, and all of our work on climate change at the Lincoln Institute website. Just go to lincolninst.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter @LandPolicy. And please tune in next time for Land Matters, the podcast of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. I'm your host, Anthony Flint. Thanks for listening. We're finding answers in land.